18th, 2024 special board meeting to order. We are convened as of 4:31 p.m. I would respectfully ask everyone to remain muted unless you are recognized to speak. Thank you for joining us. Please note that the meeting of the RTD Board of Directors will be audio and video recorded. Meeting recordings and unofficial minutes of the meetings are posted as soon as practicable on the board's website. We are also providing communication access real-time translation, also known as CART. Additionally, the CART transcript can be automatically translated into Spanish for anyone who would like to access a live transcript of this meeting in Spanish. Anyone who would like access to this service should please send an email to the RTD board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com, and a link will be provided. Also, a live stream of this meeting is available via RTD's YouTube page. Directors and members of staff, for the sake of the record, if you would like to be acknowledged during today's proceedings, please raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call upon you before proceeding to speak. Directors and staff participating by phone can also raise their virtual hands to indicate they would like to speak by pressing *9 and can then toggle their mute settings with *6. I will now call for the roll. Treasurer Bouquet.
Present.
Director Broom.
Present.
Director Busick.
Here.
First Vice Chair Catlin.
Here.
Director Deschel.
Here.
Second Vice Chair Geisinger.
Here.
Secretary Guzman.
I am here.
Director Harwick.
Here.
Director Lewis.
Present.
Director Rosenthal.
Present.
Director Ruscia.
Present.
Director Sloan.
Here.
Director Tisdale.
Present.
Director Whitmore.
Present.
And this is Director Davidson. I am here. That is 15 present with 0 absent. Next is our public participation period, which is open to anyone who would like to address the board. If you would wish to speak and have not done so, you can raise your virtual hand on Zoom or press *9 on your phone. Staff will unmute you when it is your turn to speak, and if you are dialed in, you can use *6 to toggle your mute settings. Please bear in mind that participating in this process, you are being recorded, and if you do not wish to be recorded, you may submit your comments in writing to the board office. If any speaker has documentation or reference materials for the board, or if any member of the public would like to submit written comments, please email the materials to the board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. During this time, the board will not offer any direct comments or responses. However, if you would like to be contacted, you may indicate in an email to the board office. At this meeting, this is a special board meeting that is scheduled prior to the Finance and Planning Committee. So we are on a limited time, and I am going to request that speakers be limited as noticed to 1 minute to provide any comments so that the board can hear everybody who would like to speak and still have time to get through our agenda on time for Finance and Planning. Speakers should begin their remarks by stating their names and will have up to 1 minute to provide their comments. Has anyone raised their virtual hand? I'll now ask for Mr. Kroll to assist in that process.
Chair Davidson, this is Jack Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office. At this time, I do not see anyone present who has indicated a desire to provide public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Kroll. Have any emailed comments been received for today's meeting?
You all have not received any email comments specific to this meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kroll. With no participants in the queue, and I will pause for a moment, we will close the public comment period at this time and move to our recommended action portion of the agenda. There is one recommended action on the agenda listed as Section 4, Action A. This is with respect to the House Bill 241447 board position. It is for the Board of Directors to adopt a position on House Bill 241447 or HB 1447. I would like at this time as chair to make a motion to adopt an opposed position on House Bill 241447. Do I have a second?
Motion.
I believe I heard Director Rosenthal as the second, with Director Davidson as the movement. Before opening up for discussion, I would like to state my reasons for recommending this opposed position. I have listened carefully to feedback from directors who have provided their feedback at earlier meetings throughout the past few weeks. I have also listened carefully to the feedback that this board has received, as I know we all have. I have not heard any support positions or amend positions from directors, hence my recommendation to adopt the opposed, and in fact have heard things that would indicate an opposed position. I would like to summarize some of those items that I have heard conveyed with respect to concerns of House Bill 241447 to help guide our further discussion from here. I'll go through these points now. First of all, HB 241447 legislatively overrides a decision made by the voters who established RTD's current governance model. This move not only bypasses the democratic process, but also does so without comprehensive public outreach, which would be necessary for such a significant change. It's essential to recall that RTD is primarily funded by our taxpayers and riders, who contribute over 75% of RTD's revenues. Any shifts in how RTD is governed must involve their input extensively to ensure inclusive and effective governance. Moreover, as this board has expressed concerns about and heard concerns about directly from riders and rider advocacy groups, this bill proposes at-large elections and fewer districts with a higher number of voters, which threatens to simultaneously dilute voter representation and increase campaign costs, raising barriers rather than lowering them for equitable representation. Additionally, this bill mandates that RTD adhere to the recommendations made by the Accountability Committee. This is redundant since RTD is already implementing these recommendations, which is the subject of an ongoing audit of the Office of the State Auditor. While this bill cites the Accountability Committee's recommendations, it entirely ignores the committee's findings on governance, which did not identify any clear substantive problems with RTD's existing structure, and further and importantly, recommended extensive study and extensive stakeholder engagement if any governance restructuring is contemplated in the future. Furthermore, it is not clear what problems are being solved by HB 241447. And in fact, there are several underlying flawed assumptions that the bill seems to be predicated on, which is another thing that I have heard directors comment on. One specific example in the current draft of the bill is the assertion in the bill summary that directors represent only their district. This shows a misunderstanding of the fiduciary duties of the RTD Board of Directors, as with any board, who are obliged to act in the best interest of the entire organization and all of its users, not just their electoral districts, which this board consistently does do. Additionally, HB 241447 does not clearly address the most pressing issues facing RTD. Instead, the bill introduces changes that seem to be misaligned with the actual needs of RTD and its stakeholders, including the taxpayers and riders who fund the system. Moreover, despite these significant changes in governance, HB 241447 does not propose any new funding models to match the increased control it creates. Finally, and significantly, with the legislative session rapidly approaching its end, this bill is being rushed with amendments and changes that are still in discussion, which is far from ideal for the thoughtful policymaking process that would be necessary to make such a significant change, especially when the definition of problems being solved for are not clear, no study has been conducted, the public has not been engaged, and stakeholder engagement and consensus is limited. That concludes my remarks summarizing some of the primary concerns that I have heard this board express, as well as some of the stakeholders of RTD that have communicated their concerns to us. At this time, before we move on to questions and comments from directors, I would like to call on Michael Davies, our Government Relations Officer, to present additional aspects of this bill as presented in the board report and touch on those things that may impact staff from an administrative burden standpoint. Mr. Davies, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair and members of the board. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer. Regarding House Bill 1447, the written report that was provided to the board provides a section by section summary all the way through section 22 of the bill. There's 22 sections in the bill. I'm not going to go through each section, but I want to go through and provide a brief summary of a few of the most consequential sections, and would be happy then to take any questions from the board regarding other sections. Section 2 of the bill requires RTD to submit fixed route service delivery plans to the Denver Regional Council of Governments for review and comment. Also included in Section 2 is direction for the Colorado Department of Transportation to contract with a third party to study the RTD boundary size and service to align with certain goals. That study is to be submitted to RTD, the General Assembly, and the Governor's Office by March 1st, 2026. Section 5 of the bill establishes a transitional board to serve in an at-large capacity from January 1st, 2025 until December 31st, 2026. The transitional board is comprised of 7 current board members whose terms expire December 31st, 2026, 2 new directors elected at large during the November 2024 election, 2 directors appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate, 2 non-voting ex officio directors appointed by Dr. Krog, the executive, and finally the executive director of CDOT or their designee, also serving in a non-voting ex officio role. Section 6 establishes a new board of directors beginning January 1st, 2027, that would be comprised of 10 members total. 7 members would be voting directors, including 3 directors elected by district, 2 elected at large, and 2 appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. 3 non-voting ex officio members would be included in the same manner as the transitional board. Additionally, the new board is also required to develop, with community input, a mandatory onboarding program for incoming directors. Section 13 of the bill requires RTD to complete and submit to the General Assembly a 10-year strategic plan that aligns with certain goals and considers aspects of the study that I mentioned in Section 2 of the bill that would be completed by CDOT. Section 15, and this is the last section I'm going to summarize. Section 15 requires RTD to create dashboards to reflect financial, capital projects, ridership, and recruitment retention information. Much of that information and dashboards are very much mirror accountability committee recommendations. And with that, I will conclude my remarks, and as mentioned, happy to answer any questions about other sections or topics of interest included in the bill for the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davies, for your report. Much appreciated. I'm going to open up for discussion, debate, questions on this item, and we'll open up to any director wishing to provide additional comments on the proposed legislation. I did just want to lay out some ground rules, given where we are, to be mindful of our time constraints, given the Finance and Planning Committee meeting approaching, and also given our opportunities to testify on the bill tomorrow. I would ask each director to please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. Also, I would ask that any questions posed to staff, notably Mr. Davies, be limited to those that will influence directors' decisions. Once we have heard from each director, I will see if there are any further comments to circle back around, and would ask directors to keep those second comments as limited as possible. Again, I would like to remind this team that there is an opportunity to testify before the House Transportation, Housing and Local Government Committee tomorrow at 1:30 at the committee hearing where this will be heard. It is our understanding that this bill may be laid over, but testimony will be heard. I would like to remind everybody that we do believe that this bill is subject to change and amendments are still being discussed despite the late nature of the session here. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up for any questions for Mr. Davies, again, limited to those that may influence decision, as well as any discussion or comments that directors would like to offer at this time. Secretary Guzman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My fellow board members, last night I had the pleasure and the distinct honor of hosting a town hall with several of you, and the overwhelming information that I got back from community was that this was probably not the right move. Their perspective and their feedback to me and to several of us in the room was that they are concerned with the fact that they would be losing representation through their paying in of the system and having a voice at the table. There have been a lot of us talking about this and having conversation, but I do believe that the breakdown of this work and this information as laid out in the board packet leads me to the conclusion that it's probably best to oppose at this point. I have also not heard any support from this from anybody that I have interacted with. And just for the record, attending the City Council of Denver meeting this morning, where their governance committee did discuss opposition to this bill from the point of view of the Denver local elected nonpartisan representatives of the city, was very aligned, and they appear to be in an opposed position as well. Although there is more to come on that, we should receive further updates from them. But I wanted to be there to hear what they had to say, as my district is fully inside the city and county of Denver. So I add that to the compliments, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Director Busick, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your comments. I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said. It appears to me, and hopefully we'll focus on some of these things tomorrow in testimony. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that. I'm happy to be there. It might help. This legislation focuses on two assumptions, as you indicated, that are not valid. First, that we do not have a professional board of directors. Obviously, we all know why that's wrong. But the legislation doesn't say how replacing one elected board with another elected board somehow overcomes this professional requirement of this board of directors. The other argument that continually gets made is that the size of our board is too large and we need a smaller, more nimble board. As I stated in the RTC, Dr. Garg RTC meeting this morning, boards like ours and governments as well operate at the speed of government. And the speed of government is necessary for a number of reasons. First, a lot of times it's required by law, by statute, state and federal, that we engage in certain processes in a certain time frame in order to make decisions. Secondly, in order to ensure transparency, we do a significant amount of public outreach. And sometimes that interferes with the ability to make decisions at the snap of a finger, because we have to get input from people. And I think getting that input is much more important than being able to snap our fingers and make a decision. So this nimble argument, I think is a fallacy. I don't think we have that problem. And as I had Mr. Kroll find out for me, if you look at the RTD district, and you count the number of House and Senate seats that live within the RTD, there are 61 of them, and they manage to govern just fine. So I don't think the size of the board impacts the ability to be nimble, to make appropriate decisions. And once you make that argument, if you think you're going to be faster with a smaller board, what's going to suffer is transparency. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Busick. First Vice Chair Catlin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your very good discussion about rationale for opposition to this bill. I wanted to make a couple other points. Each of us represents an individual district, and because we represent that district, our constituents feel comfortable and compelled to contact us individually to bring forth issues. If we were all to serve at large then we could all be getting similar requests or requests from people across the district that might put us at conflict or create some conflict with one another. I think it's very efficient the way we can channel some of those citizen concerns and comments through an individual director and to the board office or management of RTD. So I believe that even though we do try to act as directors responsible for the whole agency, I think that manner of communication is very effective. One other thing I wanted to mention is that both Director Davidson and I were appointed by our county commissioners through an competitive application process. This bill would eliminate the county's or city's ability to do so. And the third comment I have is that I am not certain what qualifications CDOT would bring to the training of our mass transit bus operators. That's just a comment I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, First Vice Chair. Director Sloan, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair Davidson. The comments so far have made me proud to be on this board and have made me realize, what a diverse, intelligent group of people we have here. I have 3 questions. None of them have long answers. They're for those of you who have been more involved in this process, and maybe Mr. Davies would be the best one to answer. Before we vote, I'd like to know what changes, number one, what changes are being proposed at this late night hour on a hodgepodge bill. 2 is funding. One for RTD, one of the changes. And finally, if it is laid over, does that mean it is really impossible for the bill to be considered in this legislative session? Thank you.
Thank you, Director Sloan. I'm happy to address those. And then Mr. Davies, I'll turn over to you if there's anything you'd like to add. We've spent some time together working on this here. So thank you for the question, Director Sloan. I think it's really too early to know what changes may come through. There's a lot that's being discussed, and our understanding is that there are potential amendments underway, primarily aimed around the governance structure, and that there is discussion around potentially changing, eliminating, reducing the number of at-large seats, given the overwhelming feedback that those at-large seats create a very high campaign barrier. There is some discussion of potentially increasing the number of districts that would directly elect directors, similar to what we have now with the 15, but a fewer number of those. There is some discussion around other changes to this bill that I think it's just not especially clear at this point. So I think the bill sponsors, from my understanding, have heard the concerns of the community regarding these changes to representation and are now working on amendments, most of which I have heard have been, what are the right number of elected by district seats, and should there be any at-large seats? Regarding the issue of funding that you had raised, in the beginning there was some discussion, and I think it's no surprise to anyone on this board. I feel very strongly that at some point, given what our long-term forecasts are, we are going to need to partner with our state to identify additional ways to bolster and backstop transit funding. When we had started this process, we had been told that governance changes are necessary to make way for that. I'm still not clear that we're going in the right order here, and at this point, there is no funding that's being proposed. There have been discussions, there have been rumors about funding that might come in the future. I can certainly lend my perspective that I believe that should that come to fruition, it's important to understand the impact of those funds, the longevity of those funds, in order to best understand and study how that may or may not influence the governance structure. So at this time, no funding has been proposed. although there continues to be the same types of discussions that we heard several months ago that perhaps there could be, and governance is important to make changes to allow for that. In terms of the bill being laid over, now my understanding is that this isn't being postponed indefinitely at this point, that in fact this is to allow time for amendments to be made. We are starting to hear the positions of other groups at this point, and there are potentially some amend positions that will be coming forward from stakeholders, although there have been quite a few opposed at this point. So I don't believe suggesting that the bill would be indefinitely postponed, but rather that amendments will be pursued to answer the concerns of stakeholders, particularly those that have expressed amend positions. Mr. Davies, is there anything that you would add to clarify anything with respect to Director Sloan's questions?
No, thank you, Chair. Nothing further.
Director Sloan, does that address your questions? Great, thank you very much. Director Whitmore, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, quickly, I just want to publicly acknowledge your work on this matter. It's a very tough situation, as we all know. And I just want to say that I appreciate your summary. I think it encapsulates so many of the key points, and it's going to be presented by you tomorrow in a professional manner. And that's the way we've handled this whole situation, we as the board and certainly our staff. And I just hope that that comes shining through with our testimony tomorrow. I will not be able to be there due to a work obligation I cannot escape. I too, Director Sloan, very proud of being part of this body. This is a professional board, and this is a nimble board. So let me give an anecdotal story of how I can justify that statement. It began at 9:21 a.m. this morning when a city manager of one of the cities that I represent reached out and wanted to have another session with our CEO and general manager and myself and other staff members. She's not in town. She's got other work to do in Washington, D.C. upon request. And by 1 o'clock, we had a meeting date set with her tremendously busy schedule that works with the city council's work session. I would submit that acts like this happen frequently, and it can be handled easily for 15 of us by our great board office and the support staff that Deborah has. I would say this is a classic example of being both nimble and professional. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Whitmore. Director Lewis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to share with you that most of the transit organizations that I have worked with who follow transit policy, or most of them are going to be in an amend position. And though we preferred to take an opposition to the bill, I would, again, I trust you, Chair Davidson. I hope that they give you more time to speak tomorrow than just 2 minutes. But I know you've set a collaborative tone, and I appreciate that. But there are 2 or 3 issues out there that I think are still kind of negotiable, and I have talked to, or staff has shared me their thoughts on it. But one is the market rate for properties, and the other one is this study of the entire region. I would not fear that study for the region, and I'm going to give you a reason why. I think it, again, will prove how much money it takes to do these projects. And I'll be honest with you, I'm getting very frustrated hearing about Seattle, Seattle, Seattle. And then when you look at them, you realize that they have 3 transit agencies running King County. So I have no fear of them doing another study on the region if that helps identify the financial needs that RTD needs. And I trust all of us tomorrow will present ourselves well. And again, I reiterate what Director Whitmore said. I think, Mr. Chair, you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Lewis. And thank you, Director Lewis and Director Whitmore, for the personal comments. I very much appreciate it. And I would bounce that right back. This was a very stressful period and difficult period as we contemplate a number of legislative matters. I would like to thank this board for your collaborative attitude and patience throughout the process. And also, I'd very much like to thank staff. Mr. Davies, thank you for all the work that you have put into this. And I very much thank staff for the patience as board members do go through this process. And this is already an incredibly stressful time in transit, as we know, with tremendous priorities that the agency is facing, ranging from our deferred maintenance projects to optimizing and working to optimize the operating environment for our employees. There's many number of issues going on right now, and I thank everybody for their patience dealing with a stressful time. Director Ruscia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note, as the individual on this board that frequently raises their hands and suggests reforms or says, what about this, or how about we do that? And as the one who wrote the 2020 RTD reform bill, and in fact, that's how I met several of you. And Director Lewis was there. We worked with CCDC. If I thought this bill helped riders of any community, if I thought this bill helped the disability community, if I thought this bill helped the board become more effective, or if this bill could somehow provide more transit, I would be in support. Even if it, frustrated some of my colleagues, and this bill doesn't do any of those things. And I think the saddest part for me is that there were many, many months in which we could have been stakeholdered with more effectively, and no one came to us and said, "Hi, we're hearing this feedback. What do you need to be successful?" And I think that's a shame, because as the one who is sort of this self-styled reformer, at least when I ran for this office, maybe there are some things that could be or could have been done. But we are at the 11th hour and there are just a few weeks left of session. Finally, I want to stress that this bill will impact our workforce and the ATU, and potentially their right to effectively collectively bargain. As I think most of you know, they are in a strong oppose position. There are other unions coming out in an oppose position because they see this as dangerous and they want to show solidarity with frontline workers. And to me, I think that it's not just about the governance of this board; it's about the people that we serve, and we also are responsible for the health and well-being of our workforce. And I don't believe they were included in this conversation, including the training aspect. The same with the disability community. I don't think we were included in this conversation. And while I don't think the sponsors have any ill intent, because I can understand the frustrations, I just wanted to, I just felt like those things needed to be said on the record. I concur with the other statements made by directors, as well as yourself, Mr. Chair. But we represent the communities that we serve, yes. And I think we all ran because we care about public transit. All of us want more public transit. And just the idea that, and I'm so sorry if I'm hitting my 2 minutes, sir, you can cut me off, but just the idea, that we don't do things on behalf of the whole region suggests that, perhaps people don't know how this board works or seen what we've done. but that all of the sudden, the far Northeast where I represent disappears on a map January 1st of next year. And you know, the folks that I ran, that like my neighbors, you know, I taught high school here. I raised a kid here. I know every single line here, every single R&O. And this is a volunteer job. And we do this because we love our communities. Board size, you know, if anything, might be too small if you consider massive population growth. But again, I just wish someone had said, hey, this is what we're hearing, and what can we do to help? Because I think we'd all feel better. I think the sponsors are hurt at some of the feedback, and I think we're all rightfully hurt at some of the you know, tenor. And so with that, I mean, I would obviously going to be a strong oppose. And I just would also add that as we do our testimony tomorrow, one thing I found in speaking with legislators and other groups is that they don't realize how much we do every day, practically unpaid, that isn't necessarily in the news or in a community meeting or on the record. We're also advocates, and we serve as a point of customer service. And even, you know, and we also get policy done through working with staff and our GM CEO. We do a lot that people can't see. So tomorrow in my testimony, I'm going to talk very briefly about who I represent, but I'm going to list some of the things, you know, that I've worked on or working on or were able to get done. Just briefly touch on a couple of points. And I think that might also help the committee understand, you know, not just how difficult this job is, but how well we really are doing, giving the limited resources that we have. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Director Ruscia. Director Tisdale, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate and applaud the comments of all of the directors, including yourself, and I concur in each and all of them. I won't say any more arguments in opposition because they've been expressed and we'll be testifying to that tomorrow, but I feel in this forum for this group, I am compelled to recall the words of Sir Thomas More when he was put on trial for his refusal to sign the supremacy oath. And it was a capital crime, and he was to be executed for refusing to do it. And Thomas More said to that assemblage, "It is not for the supremacy oath that you have sought my blood, but because I would not bend to the marriage." It is important to understand that there is no problem with governance that has been identified, articulated, or even hinted at. And that's not what this bill is about. It's because we would not bend to the marriage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. Thank you, directors, for all of your comments. I completely concur with everything that's been stated from directors and very much appreciate the tenor of the conversation. It is disappointing. I think none of us should ever be afraid of change in pursuit of a more perfect system and more perfect region. And we have a lot of things to work together on transit, but I sure would love to work together and be asking questions about how to improve transit in the region. So hopefully we will have those opportunities in the future to come. At this point, seeing no further discussion, questions, or comments from directors, I'm going to go ahead and call for a roll vote. Treasurer Bouquet.
Yes, in favor of opposition.
Yes, I should have restated that the motion at hand is to take an opposed position on HB 241447. Thank you, Treasurer. I will record that as a yes. Director Broom,
yes,
Director Busick,
Yes.
First Vice Chair Catlin,
Yes.
Director DeShell,
Yes.
Second Vice Chair Geisinger,
yes,
Secretary Guzman,
C, yes.
Director Harwick,
Yes.
Director Lewis,
Yes.
Director Rosenthal,
Yes.
Director Rusha,
Yes.
Director Sloan,
yes,
Director Tisdale,
Yes.
Director Whitmore,
Yes.
and I am a yes. This is Chair Davidson. With 15 aye votes and 0 no votes and 0 abstentions, the motion passes. Thank you, directors. Thank you, members of staff, for being here. Seeing no further discussion, actually, let me just clarify. I will call for a motion to adjourn, and we will adjourn, but there is another meeting tonight. It is the Finance and Planning Committee meeting. So those of you that are participating in Finance and Planning, please don't go anywhere. You can keep in this Zoom meeting, but we will start at the 5:30 p.m. time when we're called to order by Committee Chair Tisdale. But there is no need to leave this meeting prior to that. So with that being stated, with no further discussion, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
second,
All right, great, thank you. The meeting will be adjourned as of 5:13 p.m. See you all at Finance and Planning. Thank you very much.
All right, just checking in with staff. Do we know whether we have everyone from CU Leeds School of Business available with us this evening for our meeting?
I see Mr. Lewandowski, Mr. McNown. So, yeah. There's usually
Where's
a third member. Yeah, where's
Rich?
Rich
yeah,
is
where's
traveling.
Welbekind? Where's the Wonderkind Welbekind?
Yeah.
He's in. He can't join us tonight, unfortunately.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, well, that's all right. You guys can muddle through as best you can without Rich being there to guide us and give that great leadership.
Excuse me,
All right,
Mr.
so- I'm sorry, what?
Matt, sorry, this is Director Rucha. I was in transit earlier and I was zooming in from my phone and I would like to switch devices. So I just wanted to advise I'm going to hop off because this is a meeting that requires a much larger screen. I will return and I apologize for my tardiness. I just want to make sure I'm using the most effective technology for a meeting such as this. Thank you,
I
sir.
appreciate that. We will definitely keep ourselves tuned in and I will acknowledge your presence when you make it.
Thank you, sir.
All right, so this is a 30-second warning to staff. 30 seconds before we start the video. We're just after the hour of 5:30 p.m. So we're almost there. And let's see what I've got. All right, so staff, are you ready to start recording? Good evening. The Tuesday, April 16th Finance and Planning Committee of the RTD will now come to order. We are convened as of 5:31 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. I would respectfully ask everyone who is attending this meeting, please to mute yourself unless you are recognized to speak. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us this evening and to remind you that the committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors will continue to be held remotely via Zoom, and they will be audio and video recorded. The meeting recordings, along with the unofficial transcript of the minutes of the meetings, will be posted as soon as practicable on the board's website. And during today's meeting, we will also be providing to you what is called Communication Access Real-Time Translation. That's also known as CART. The CART provides access to everyone to see what exactly we are saying. Anyone who would like access to this CART service should send an email to the board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com, and a link will be provided to you. Additionally, the CART transcript can be automatically translated into Spanish for anyone who would like access to a live transcript of the meeting in Spanish. And finally, a live stream of this meeting is also being made currently and available for replay via RTD's YouTube page. I would now like to call the roll for the committee members who are present this evening. Director Bob Broom.
Present.
Director Peggy Catlin.
Here.
Director Bobby Deschel. Director Deschel. Okay. Director Lynn Geisinger.
Here.
Director Michael Guzman, Vice Chair.
Here.
Director Joanne Rusha.
Present.
Excellent. And I am the chair of this committee, Doug Tisdale, and I am present. And for the record, I note that we also have Director Jamie Lewis is present with us. Excuse me. And I see Board Chair Eric Davidson is here, and Director Troy Whitmore is here, and Director Marjorie Sloan is here. Are there any other directors who are present whom I have not identified? All right, good. Then we would now proceed to the public comment portion of our meeting. And this is where anyone who wishes to address the committee regarding any topic that is listed in the published meeting agenda for this current month or for the immediately preceding month will have an opportunity to speak. If you wish to speak and you haven't already done so, please either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone. Now, during this time, excuse me, the committee will not offer any direct comments or responses to whatever you may say. However, if you would like to be contacted personally regarding the comment that you make, please email the RTD board office at, once again, rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. And so now in this public comment session, I will ask our board executive manager, Mr. Kroll, has anyone raised their hands?
Hi, Committee Chair Tisdale. This is Jack Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office. We do not have anyone present who has raised their hand indicating a desire to provide public comment.
All right, good. Then that forestalls my need to give further disclaimers about if you don't want to be recorded, you have to submit in writing and so on and so forth. So we don't have anyone who has indicated a desire to address us directly. Were there any email comments that have been received by the board staff?
Thank you, Committee Chair Tisdale. We did not receive any email comments relative to this meeting.
All right, thank you. Then with no participants in the queue and with no emails having been received, we will now officially close the public comment period at this time. Before we move on to the next item on our agenda, I want to take a moment to explain to the committee about a change in our work plan. You will recall that the committee has a work plan that we adopted that identifies topics that will be addressed by us at various times over the course of the year. You will also recall that the work plan indicated that we would be having a conversation about Tabor and about the polling that RTD has done on that topic at our meeting this evening. Well, simply put, despite the very best efforts and the great hard work of our staff and the directors involved in the Revenue Diversification Working Group, we do not yet have those results to share with you. So as such, I will continue to communicate with Board Chair Davidson, who is the board's primary representative on the Revenue Diversification Working Group, and I will endeavor to provide this committee and possibly the full board with a substantive and productive update on our polling efforts regarding Tabor as soon as is reasonably practicable. Thank you very much for your kind and patient understanding with that. The next portion of our agenda relates to information from external entities. And there is one external entity report on our agenda this evening. It's one we always look forward to. It's the, semi-annual sales and use tax forecast that we get from the CU Leeds School of Business. This will be for the March 2024 sales and use tax forecast. And at this time, I will call upon Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, to introduce this item and to introduce our distinguished guests from the CU Leeds School of Business. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening. As the chair mentioned, this is one of two semi-annual forecasts that RTD receives regarding its sales and use taxes. Within the committee package, there is the presentation materials as well as the full report that is the forecast for March 2024. A lot of good detailed information in that packet. If you haven't seen it already, I would recommend paging through that. However, this evening we do have our distinguished guests from the CU Leeds School of Business Research Division, Robert McNown and Brian Lewandowski, joining us to walk us through a presentation. So gentlemen, please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Doug. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Yes, so thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the RTD board committee members. And I also must really thank staff, Doug McLeod and other people who are supporting this work, Monica, Kristen, and Todd, and others who feed us a lot of input data so that we're able to adequately run our forecast for RTD twice a year. This is a forecast that we've been doing since 2011. And as Doug mentioned, we do produce a pretty detailed report. We've cut it down to about 50 pages now, but there's a lot of information about the forecast, the short-term forecast, the long-term forecast, as well as a lot of detail about our assumptions and measuring our error over time. And so this is a pretty interesting project that we do because we are updating the model and reacting to real collections that RTD receives, as well as reacting to changes in the economy and sometimes very dramatic changes in the economy when we go through events like the great financial crisis or when we go through the COVID pandemic. So we're constantly revising and updating and reflecting on these economic changes and revenue changes. And I'm really pleased to share that our short-term forecast tends to have an error of less than 1% over time. This is something we discuss in the report. And we have a tendency to be a little bit low in our forecast versus high. So over time, we've been high 77 times and low 94 times. So we're fairly split. Our tendency isn't to always be high or always be low in our forecast, but we do have a slight tendency to be low in our short-term outlook. So again, my name is Brian Lewandowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Business Research Division at the Leeds School of Business, University of Colorado Boulder. Tonight, I'm joined by Dr. Robert McNown, and we have three other team members who are not with us this evening, Miles Light, Richard Wabekind, and Adam Illig. So the way this will work, I will run through and provide you with a very brief economic outlook, talking about current economic conditions and expectations. And then I will pass it over to Dr. McNown, who will describe the model updates and the revenue forecast. So I like to start with the national economic outlook, and I chose these 12 metrics up on your screen. These aren't happenstance. These tend to be many or mostly the metrics that the National Bureau of Economic Research looks at when deciding if the U.S. is in an economic expansion or if we're in a recession or somewhere in between. And I will say that economic conditions really have improved over the last year. You may remember a year ago and a year and a half ago when the national sentiment was much more negative about the economy in general. And it really was reflected when we would put this slide up on the screen. There were many of these metrics that had red arrows or yellow arrows with very few green. And now when we just take a quick glance at this screen, you can see that most of these metrics are moving in a positive direction. So GDP is not only positive, but this broad measure of gross output in our economy has been exceeding expectations. Employment growth has been extremely resilient, despite the pressures that we've seen in terms of inflation and in terms of Fed policy trying to combat inflation. We see that even the manufacturing sector, which was considered in a contractionary phase for 16 consecutive months, it just turned positive last month. So that manufacturing sentiment is even increasing. And prices are improving. I would still say they are higher than economists would like them to be, but they're coming down. And debt is growing, but at a slower rate. And so then we zoom out and look at consumer confidence. And when we look at the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey or the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index, we see improvement year over year. And even 6 months over 6 months, we're seeing improved confidence with a little bit of volatility from month to month. Business confidence has been improving. Even our own Leeds Business Confidence Index is now positive after many quarters of being negative. So just as a quick barometer, we see general improvements within the economy. And I'll focus on real GDP for just a moment. So just a reminder that real GDP means that it is adjusted for inflation. So even after we have stripped off these high rates of price growth that we've seen over the last several quarters, we still see real growth year over year of 1% and annualized growth over the last quarter of 3.4%. And real GDP, the four major components of GDP are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And really, we saw a pretty good year of growth overall in 2023 for consumption, investment, and government spending. On the consumption front, both goods and services posted strong growth. And the goods piece is very important when we think about RTD revenue, because we're looking at taxable goods, not really services, because services are largely not taxable. So nationally, we're seeing strong growth in GDP. For 2024, the expectation now is growth of a little over 2%, perhaps slowing a little bit further in 2025. So I mentioned inflation very briefly a moment ago. This visualizes it a little bit. So you can see that inflation really started to take off in the first or even maybe the second quarter of 2021. And we look at this all items index, which is really this the full basket of goods and services that consumers buy. And we saw price growth accelerate to 9% in June of 2022 before as price growth started easing. And I think what's interesting, when we just take a very quick look at this chart on the left, is that almost as quickly as prices went up, price growth came back down. But it hit a floor between 3 and 4%. And that seems to be where we're stuck. And so we got an inflation report last week that was a little unsettling, where prices grew faster than expected, about 3.5%. And so it shows that we're not quite back where we need to be before we start seeing the Fed cut interest rates. On the right-hand side of this chart, I think it's also important to focus on upstream prices. So we look at the producer price index. And I also chose two components of the PPI, manufacturing and construction inputs, which exclude labor costs. And here you can see even greater volatility, where prices ended up peaking at about 20 to 25% in terms of price growth. But price growth not only normalized, but went negative within these indices. So even though they're increasing month over month, the year over year growth is flat at best, even a little bit negative when we take a look at the overall index. And we can look a little bit more closely in the Denver metro region. So this data is reported down to the metropolitan area nationally, not for all metro areas. So when we talk about Colorado inflation, the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood MSA is really a proxy for that. And interesting thing about price growth locally is that we tend to have higher inflation than the national index. In fact, when we take a look at the last 14 years, the Denver MSA recorded faster price growth than the country overall 11 of those years. And then in 1 year we tied, so we only really had 2 years of price growth slower than the nation. So on the right side, you can see a table that shows the March CPI number, Consumer Price Index numbers, and I put it up here by component. So if you're ever curious, when I say the basket of goods and services, these are the high-level components of that basket of goods and services. And what's important here to note is that housing comprises 44% of that basket, followed by transportation, which is 17%, and food and beverages, which is 14%. And so when we take a look back over time, this housing piece has been a really critical reason why Denver's index has run a little bit hotter than the country overall. So the good news in March is that this is a turn for the Denver area where we had slower inflation than the country. I wouldn't consider this a trend, it's just a single observation. But the only real discernible difference here is the decrease in transportation costs compared to the country. And I would even trace that back a little further to our gasoline prices being about 15% cheaper than the national gasoline index. So how's Colorado's economy doing overall when we benchmark to other states across the country? We are still a state that tends to be outperforming the US in general. And so this is a narrative that we've shared now for about the last 13 years since emerging from the financial crisis. And when we take a look at some of these major components, real GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2023, we recorded 3.2% growth, which put us just above average for state growth nationally. I think the really positive metric here is that Colorado's employment growth in February ranked us 10th nationally. So you've often perhaps heard us talk about Colorado being a top 10 state. We've returned that mark. And in fact, when employment revisions were applied to 2023 job growth, we talked about this in prior meetings, these expected revisions, they came to fruition. And for 2023, Colorado's job growth got pushed up to 11th best in the country. So we do continue to outperform in terms of job growth. Population growth, this is an area of concern for us where we are above average in general, but 0.6% population growth is just an area we haven't spent much time in, but we have for the last few years. And we think of population growth as bringing in trained, skilled workers that are ready to go to work today. And if we have that slower job growth, slower population growth, we think that also dampens future job growth in the state. But in general, we see pretty good growth in income. We see pretty good wages in Colorado. We see high labor force participation in the state. So we look at a quick barometer of the state's economy and say it's actually outperforming most states in recent years. So our 2023 job growth was revised up to 2.5% growth. This beat our expectations a little bit for 2023. We're still expecting a slowdown in 2024, partially driven by this labor force constraint. We're already on the high end of labor force participation. And if we're not bringing in that much in population, and we have 30 to 40,000 retirees per year, it's really hard to continue growing jobs at a fast pace. So we think that will dampen job growth in 2024. And we also continue to suffer from a labor shortage, which is a national phenomenon. And this actually started before the COVID pandemic started, but it really was exacerbated by the pandemic and by demographic shifts as we've had a wave of retirees hit the Colorado and national markets. And so we take a look at job openings and we take a look at the number of unemployed individuals in the economy and just do a very quick ratio to show that there's 1.7 job openings for every unemployed individual. And even if you matched up all of those unemployed with jobs, there'd still be a shortage of workers. And that's even if you could match based on skills, wages, location, occupation, and so on. So we don't expect this labor shortage issue to get resolved quickly, but we do see signs that this gap is closing. So we're sort of inching our way towards improvement, but it won't be solved anytime soon. And then just a couple more slides from me. I put this up here because we like taking a look at national retail sales and Colorado taxable sales. This is a fundamental part of the model that Robert will discuss in just a moment. But it shows that there is clearly a relationship between Colorado retail activity and national retail activity. You can see that the ebbs and flows, the changes within retail activity tend to sort of match each other locally and nationally. And usually Colorado is a leading state when it comes to retail growth. We've been lagging a little bit over the last year, but there was some good news that came out of the national retail sales report for March. We saw 4% growth year over year in national retail, and we saw 0.7% growth month over month. So despite what we consider to be consumer headwinds, we see continued consumption in the national retail numbers. We're able to take a look at taxable sales growth within Colorado. I just got the February report yesterday, and we even saw growth year over year in Colorado taxable sales in February, though much slower than what we're seeing in the national total retail numbers. Interest rates have and continue to remain high, at least relative to the last 15 years, I should say, because they've been much higher throughout history. But the 30-year fixed mortgage rate actually ticked up over the last month, and we're seeing it having a slowing effect on the housing industry. And then the black and the gold lines, it's sort of interesting to take a look at this 3-month T-bill versus the 10-year T-note. I plot this here because what that's really pointing to is the short-term rates are higher than the 10-year rates, which is really describing an inverted yield curve, which a few points in history have been a prelude to a recession. We haven't seen a recession show up yet, but this is the longest inverted yield curve that we've had in this country in 40 years, and it just will not flip back to a normal yield curve. So I'm going to close my section by just not reading all of these, but mentioning that we do create lists of headwinds and tailwinds when putting our forecasts together. I think there is still a number of headwinds that concern us. I described a lot of good in the economy when it came to GDP growth, employment growth, income growth. Wealth is up at record levels. But when we take a look at headwinds, I'm especially focused on a couple of factors in Colorado. One, the slowing retail environment, the higher price environment that we tend to have in Colorado that we are concerned could be a drag on consumers locally. And I'll add another one here, which is property taxes. We have second from the top. And that's a concern because we know that homes and, well, really homes were reporting much higher assessed values last year. It's hitting households this year. And that's somewhat unique to Colorado, how our assessed values reset. And so we think that this diverts some consumption from other goods and services to property taxes, which could also dampen consumption and retail sales for RTD in 2024 and beyond. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McNown to briefly talk about the forecast assumptions and the forecast.
Robert?
Right. Thanks, Brian. And thanks to the board for inviting us to present our forecasts. Brian's provided the macroeconomic background, which is really central to the forecasts that we develop for RTD revenues. And in particular, as Brian's slide on consumption at both the state and national level indicated, there are common trends to many of these key variables, and we want to take advantage of that in generating our forecasts. The central component of our methodology is a model of the key indicators of the Colorado economy, some of the same variables that you see on this slide that are given here for the national economy. So let's start there. You can see these, what are actually the Moody's baseline forecasts for several U.S. economic indicators. And we believe that the Moody's baseline scenario represents the most likely path for the economy in the coming years. And so we adopt that as the input into our forecast for the state of Colorado. And then in turn, the Colorado economy, of course, drives what's going on in the district and RTD taxable sales and sales and use tax revenues. In simple terms, to kind of summarize what you see here, it looks like it's a fairly steady as you go picture of the national economy. Some of these key indicators are slowing down a bit. The employment is the only one that really seems problematic in terms of a major slowing. And I think Brian hinted at that as the result of the demographic changes that are going on that we're starting to face right now, slowing population growth, in particular slowing growth in the working age population. So the figures for 2024 at 1.4%, that's not too bad, but then 25 and 26, you can see coming down substantially. And then in terms of these other key indicators, inflation's going to come down a little slowly, and real GDP is continuing to grow at a nice moderate pace there. And then the next slide, here's a similar display now for the Colorado economic indicators. And I'd say that the picture is pretty much the same, although we do have a more favorable outlook for employment growth over the coming years. And so our demographics are not quite as unfavorable as they are at the national level. We do have some slowing in the expected number of workers here and expected employment down from 1.6% to about 1% in 2026. But still, you can see those indicators are fairly solid. Slight improvement in retail sales from 2023, which was pretty weak for us, as you're going to see when we get to the revenue forecasts. So in our methodology, then these forecasts for the Colorado economic indicators are somewhat driven by the national forecast, but at the same time, the model takes into account the interdependence between several of these key economic variables within the state. And of course, another chart you saw from Brian was that from the different rankings of Colorado across those different indicators, you can see that our economy doesn't move in lockstep with the US economy. And so we have to incorporate those differences in the model for the Colorado economy, the output that you see here. Then in the next slide. So here we come to what is, of course, our main point of focus here, that the rather stable growth in the Colorado economy that's projected and indicated on the previous slide carries over to moderate, steady growth in RTD, in this case, sales tax revenues. Well, the picture is the same for total tax revenues because sales taxes, of course, account for such a high percentage, 94% of the total tax revenues taken in by RTD. And so we're coming off a pretty weak year in 2023, where tax revenues grew by only 0.3%. And that followed a really strong year in 2022. So coming out of the pandemic, things are, were pretty volatile in 2022 and 2023. Now, according to our projections, we're back onto a path for reasonable growth in revenues, almost 3% in the current year, almost 5.5% in 2025. And then you can see continuing out to 2030, which is our medium range forecast horizon, it's fairly steady growth in revenues throughout that period. In the next slide. So we can compare our current projections with those that we've given in recent previous updates. So in particular here, the blue line indicated labeled by March 2024. So that's our current update. And so you compare that to what we were saying a year ago, the red line says March 2023. Well, so you can see what's happened is that in our projection in March 2023, the projection was that revenues would grow fairly steadily, that what seems to be almost a straight line there. And of course, what happened, as was pointed out in the previous slide, that revenue growth was almost stagnant between 2022 and 2023. And so from 2023 forward then, in making our current forecast, we're starting out at a much lower base. Our jump off point is much lower. And therefore, even though the trend lines look sort of similar in terms of the slopes, we're just starting off at a lower position here. So we always want to point out that there is some uncertainty in this forecasting exercise. And Brian's indicated that over the entire history that we've been doing this for RTD, our forecast record is pretty reasonable. But to indicate the uncertainty that's involved in the forecasting, let me talk a bit about this slide. So the dashed lines, the tan lines with the dashes, labeled high forecast and low forecast. So those are forecast bounds produced with a statistical model that such that there's a 33% probability that the actual outcome could lie above that high forecast line or below the low forecast line. So that's a pretty good depiction of the amount of uncertainty that's in the forecast. It's inherent in any sort of statistical modeling. And we always want our clients to be aware that there is going to be some error in forecasts. Another way of, let's stay with that slide. So another way of looking at this is to consider alternative scenarios that are provided by Moody's. And we've chosen two alternatives, an optimistic one, which produces an outcome slightly better than the baseline, but not dramatically so. And I think that's because we're pretty much operating at full capacity as it is. And so even if we were able to push things higher, they wouldn't go that much higher. On the other hand, the pessimistic scenario incorporates the possibility of a recession. You can see that red line actually coming down from 2023 into 24 and 25. And so that's certainly a possibility, although we're not saying we see those signs on the horizon. But Moody's has generated this scenario, taking into account some of those possible headwinds that Brian mentioned could come home to roost. And then the next slide. We do, in agreement with RTD, provide this long-range forecast And this is largely demographically driven. It takes into account the aging of the population and the slowing overall population growth as key determinants of what's going to happen in this very long forecast horizon out to 2050. And so looking at the medium forecast, take the last column there, RTD taxable sales. And you can see from the current, so these are decadal averages, averages of the annual rates of growth of these different sales indicators. And so the current decade, then we're expecting about 6% growth in RTD taxable sales, or equivalently RTD sales tax revenues, going down to 3.8% in the following decade and down to 2.1%. And so you can see how that follows the pattern of demographic drag that we're expecting for the nation and for Colorado as well, as the population ages and grows more slowly. So I think those are pretty cautious forecasts, but quite reasonable as driven by the demographic picture for the future. So next slide. Just want to emphasize a few things about the nature of the forecasting. We try to build a model that is theoretically sound and uses well-accepted economic relations and statistical principles. We do not incorporate add factors or other sorts of subjective adjustments to the model forecast, but rather use what the model predicts. We think that's what we are contracted to do, and I think, and that would be my preference in any case. We don't have a particular point of view with political basis or financial stake. We try to do the best that we can, and part of that, as Brian said, is the assistance that we get from the staff providing us with the data and comments on our forecasts and insights that the staff has about what's going on in the district. So thanks for your attention. Final slide. Just want to encourage, we're open for questions.
Sorry about that, technical difficulties. All right, thank you. So we are open now to comments, questions, interrogations, cross-examinations of our distinguished guests from the CU Leeds School. Please raise your virtual hand if you have any comments or questions for our presenters. And Mr. Vice Chair Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make one comment just so it's y'all can remind me later. Maybe Jack can help us with this, but I would like to get some statistical analysis from the State Demographer's Office about population movements within the region. Parallels to this only because of labor and sales and use. So I'm kind of trying to wrap my head around everything that y'all just said, and there's a lot of information here, so thank you for it. Since this is my second time taking a crack at it, I do want to ask a couple of questions with regard to what's projected for the baseline RTD revenue forecast with respect to the end of the Tabor extension that we have that ends this year. The numbers look great, but what scares me about what you said is the 2022-2023 year, where we see a slow growth, and that obviously has an impact on what happens where the Tabor base lies. And I'm not sure who might take this on, if it's Chair Davidson or if it's Mr. McNown or Lewandowski, but how do we understand on our end at RTD how that is going to impact what the revenues look like coming in next year and what we face in terms of what we may lose? And the question is also caused a little bit by Director Catlin's notice or comment earlier to me, just about what happened in 2008 and how we lost a bunch of money through the same sort of economic dip that we're experiencing while we try to regain growth, and understanding that the previous year sets the limitations for all state agencies under our current Tabor laws. I hope that made some kind of sense.
Well, we'll see, because I'm going to open the floor now to either Dr. McNown or Mr. Lewandowski, and perhaps Doug McLeod might want to weigh in on this too. But gentlemen, any thoughts from any of you?
Well, I would. Go ahead, Brian.
I'm just going to start by saying to your first question about demographics, we actually use the state demographers forecasts in this report. So you can reference the report and see their projections included in there, and they're cited in there. And I can always help staff pull together those numbers for you if you want to see it by county within the district. You can see it by age, you can see it the in and out migration by county, and there's a lot of interesting data in there, especially when we take a look at what's happening within the central business district. Doug, I was going to point to you for the Tabor discussion, since we were talking about this when doing our forecast.
Sure. Thank you, Brian, and thank you for the question, Vice Chair Guzman. So yes, and I don't want to preempt Chair Davidson's comments on the Revenue Diversification Working Group, but what I will say is in the month of May on the work plan for the Finance and Planning Committee, we do have scheduled for a discussion item, Tabor discussion. That is planned to discuss what is Tabor, how could it potentially affect RTD. We do have ongoing discussions with the CU Lead School of Business regarding potentially incorporating Tabor impact into the future forecasts. We had intended to bring that forward with this March forecast, but because of the work of the Revenue Diversification Working Group, we didn't feel that we had enough mature information to start making recommendations in terms of what that should look like in terms of a forecast. So in May, we will be discussing Tabor with Finance and Planning Committee, and we also will be discussing the fiscal policy, begin discussing the fiscal policy for 2025 and how that relates to impacts from Tabor, revenue diversification, and the like. So all to say, more to come, Director Guzman.
Thank you. I know it's a little all over the place, and I didn't want to jump ahead where we are not ready to go. I'm just trying to think through everything that you just said and understand it in the process of how we get to the budget at the end of the year. So thank you for responding. I did see some of the demography notes in the packet, but it's amazing we have a state demographer that can do all of this. And you know, I don't know if anybody follows CityCast podcast from Denver, but they just had a really interesting conversation about it just for the city and county of Denver. But you know, a lot of this information impacts everything that goes into understanding what happens with sales and use tax. And so there's a lot happening there. That's why it's just a prompt of series of questions. All right, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Yes, and we are blessed in Colorado to have really a phenomenal state demographer who has a wealth of information that actually can be communicated clearly so that people understand it. So we appreciate that. At this time, then, we will turn to Director Broom. You are recognized, Director.
Thank you, Chair. I had a question on forecasting use tax. Use tax is primarily the sales tax on new automobiles and on materials going into new houses. Both of those areas are really suspect right now. And what are you looking at in terms of what's going to happen to the new housing market? And will the electric car sales come to a screeching halt here?
Thank you. Some interesting probing questions. Dr. McNown, you look like you're getting set up to answer that one.
Well, I'll try to answer it. That's a pretty challenging question. Use tax is the most highly volatile series that we have to deal with. And you've pointed out the main sources of use tax, and you can understand why the use tax collections are so volatile because of the volatility in those industries. So in the case of building materials in particular, we have to rely on building permits and forecasts of building permits. We take into account forecasts coming from the national level on building permits, as well as other Colorado variables that might influence that, what's going on with personal income, for example. And then in terms of automobile sales, the volatility is not quite as great. I think overall, of course, there has been some surprises that electrical vehicle sales have not taken off as much as people might have expected, but instead the overall level of sales of vehicles, of autos, has I think been pretty stable, and so that's not a major impediment to our generating what we think is a reasonable forecast.
Thanks. With Denver being named Hockey Town USA, will that have an impact on revenue collections? I think they call that the DU effect.
Well, there are always a lot of little special factors going on, and up here in Boulder, we talk about the Coach Prime effect, and actually, in our work for the city of Denver, we couldn't find one. So I suppose the same's for DU.
Thank you.
I'm hopeful that we've had the pioneers effect. Maybe we'll have the nuggets effect here pretty soon too. All right. Other questions? And I'm sorry. First of all, Director Broom, were you concluded? Anything else that you had?
No, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lewandowski. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to respond to Director Broom as well, and just note that use taxes is only about 10% of the total sales and use tax collections for RTD. So while it is a difficult, volatile series, it doesn't drive the forecast. It's more of a margin of error on the forecast.
Yeah, and I think actually your presentation showed it at about 6% on the numbers that you had for us in this current projection. All right, other questions or comments from the committee, and for that matter, any other board member who's present in this meeting for our guests from CU Lead School? Seeing none, I want to thank Dr. McNown. I want to thank Mr. Lewandowski. I want to send greetings to Dean Wobekent, and thank you all very much for your continued excellent work for the RTD. It's been a good 13-year run so far in terms of working with you all, and your track record has been important. I remember the first time, 7 years ago, that I heard from you folks. That was one of the questions I asked, and I was delighted that you provided the substantiation for a very solid track record. All right, we will close out then that portion of our meeting and say good evening to you all. And we turn now to the update from the Revenue Diversification Working Group. And at this point, I will call upon our board chair, Eric Davidson, to present an update to this committee on the work of the RDWG.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McLeod, for touching on a few aspects there. I'll certainly be open if Mr. McLeod has any comments to add at the end. The primary focus of the Revenue Diversification Working Group really is twofold at the moment. After the investigation of different revenue diversification strategies, as I had presented previously, it became abundantly clear that the opportunities to dramatically influence our revenues and backstopping and protecting those revenues was fairly limited inside our four walls. And therefore, it became very important to determine how we are going to communicate our position. So as I had shared last time, Mr. Stuart Summers has created a website with his team and put the initial version of that online that is available under a section about RTD. It is a starting point and is being built upon. So we did have some discussion around important things to communicate. And that will continue to be an evergreen process. And as I stated last time, I invite directors to explore that and provide any feedback. Please feel free to send me feedback on that website, and I'm more than happy to communicate that back to the team. But that's one aspect of the Revenue Diversification Working Group, is realizing we need to clearly articulate and communicate our financial position. I think directors have probably seen some of the types of slideware that have also come together to help level set the community in our position. But the other major area of focus, of course, is with respect to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR, and how to mitigate the impact of our forthcoming expiration of the exemption that we have in November 2024. And as Mr. McLeod referred to or alluded to, the last discussion was with respect to the precise impact that we may experience as an agency. I think as directors will recall, we have been using a range of percentage impact in terms of how much is refunded above the TABOR cap from other government entities experiencing the loss of their TABOR exemption, and that number was ranging between 7 and 11%. However, running the calculations from a sales and use tax perspective is a little bit more complex, and there's not really a direct analog to RTD in the state right now for us to be able to easily look at. So as Mr. McLeod alluded to, staff under Mr. McLeod's direction is working with the CU Leeds School of Business and working together with other government agencies to continue to solicit feedback and input to help quantify the impact, which will, as mentioned earlier, inform our future discussions and any considerations of fiscal policies we might adopt. And of course, will be weighed in as we consider what this board decides to do with respect to TABOR. And then, of course, related, we did then discuss the polling, which Chair Tisdale, you referenced, is coming later this month. There was some refining to polling questions to approve upon the quality of the feedback that we will receive. That polling is underway to then bring back to this board. So at this time, it's really that looking at that TABOR mitigation impact, which is now partially looking at the polling and opportunities this board has, as well as the impact that we are facing to the extent to which we can quantify or forecast that, which of course will always be difficult. And then also that other piece I started with around how to communicate our financial position, more broadly speaking, in terms of what our immediate challenges are, what our midterm stability is, and what our long-term challenges look like. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll hand back to you, and certainly happy if Mr. McLeod or would want to raise his hand to contribute anything, but I'll hand back to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Board Chair. Let me ask Mr. McLeod if you have anything you'd like to offer at this time to supplement the report given to us by Director Davidson relative to the Revenue Diversification Working Group.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Chair Davidson covered it very well, so I do not have anything to add. Thank you.
All right. Then now let me open it up for questions from the committee to either Chair Davidson or Mr. McLeod relative to the work of the Revenue Diversification Working Group. And I see Director Ruscha's hand raised. Director Ruscha, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. I have my camera turned off. I'm just I'm at the computer that doesn't have a working camera, but I am present. I wanted to ask Chair Davidson if it was possible to expand upon some of the questions that we are asking in the poll. As a person who used to work in polling, you know, our poll is always, you know, is only going to be as good as the questions that we're asking. And you said you suggested there might have been some changes. Now, I understand if that's not something you are not able to share at this point, but if you could expand upon that, that's something I am particularly interested in. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Director Rusha. And as a former psychiatric epidemiologist who worked at the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, I too am curious about that. So to the extent that you can, Chair Davidson, can you share some of that with us?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rusha, for the question, and thank you, Chair Tisdale. If it's all right, I would like to take that as a follow-up. I know our Government Relations Officer, Michael Davies, who has been coordinating with our consultant, has had to drop. And we do have some things that we're working on being able to send out to the full board. So if it's okay, I'd like to take that as something that we can transmit in the form of a memo to the full board.
I think that's perfectly appropriate, and we'll take that as something on your to-do list, and we'll look forward to it when you have the opportunity to get that out to all of us. Other questions for either Board Chair Davidson or for Mr. McLeod concerning the Revenue Diversification Working Group? Director Rusha, your hand is back up.
Thank you, sir. Well, it wouldn't be a Tuesday if my hand didn't go back up. I actually just wanted to, I don't know if this is maybe a note or a clarification or request, but when the board does take a position or even considers a position, when any language is put before us, certain laws go into play regarding like the, Fair Campaign Practices Act and such. And so I was just wondering if perhaps before that happens, just so that we all understand the kind of the legalities of that, perhaps council might be able to just issue a brief memo of how that works, because there will be some limitations in what we are able to do if we do decide to move forward and to Bruce. General counsel can address this, but there has been cases in which boards were just considering initial draft language, and that was considered the start date at which position was taken. And so I see General Counsel Snyder is here and she has raised her hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Rusha. And yes, it's always a challenging area of the law, one in a constant state of flux, but we have someone who monitors all of that. And so I will call now upon that person, our General Counsel, Melanie Snyder. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Rusha, for the question. Your ears might have been burning. I was just talking with my team. There was a memo that was generated by the legal team. I think it was back in 2020 before I joined RTD, and we are actually refreshing that and polishing it, and we do anticipate that'll be issued in the next few weeks.
Thank you very much for that. We will look forward to that eagerly and to ensure that we all stay in full compliance with the law. Any other comments on the Revenue Diversification Working Group? Hearing none, we'll move on then to our recommended action portion of the agenda. We have one recommended action on the agenda for this evening. This relates to mobile ticketing and account-based ticketing contract extension. Say that 5 times fast. For the Board of Directors to approve a 2-year contract extension with Masabi LLC to continue providing the software and support necessary for the mobile ticketing and account-based ticketing, sometimes called ABT, fare collection system. May I have a motion?
So moved, Director Guzman.
I have the motion by Vice Chair Guzman. Is there a second to the motion? Well, don't all speak at once.
Second.
Thank you. Director Catlin is the second on that. So we have at this point, Mr. McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, with us to be able to present on this contract extension with Masabi. Mr. McLeod, sir.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. This was a discussion item that was brought to the Finance and Planning Committee on March 12th. So this evening is just the recommended action. No changes to that discussion item. Still a not to exceed 2-year contract, estimated amount of $6,874,500, which includes processing fees by credit card companies of approximately $3 million. And then the back end support of this system, and a large majority of our customers actually use this system. It's not just mobile ticketing; it's also EcoPass and College Pass customers. So a very critical portion of our fare structure infrastructure and critical to the agency. So would recommend that we continue with Mesabi for the next 2 years. And I am joined by our Senior Manager of Revenue, Monica Triple-Harnke, in case there are any specific questions that the committee members may have. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. McLeod. And to reiterate what we discussed last time when this was a discussion item, our finance department and staff have told us that Mesabi has performed very well under this contract, which is the reason that they are recommending to us that we extend this contract pursuant to the terms contained in the contract. And with that as a prologue, I'll ask, are there any questions or comments from any committee member relative to the recommended action to extend the Mesabi contract? And I'll go to Director Catlin in the first instance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Either Monica or Doug, what would be the consequences if this contract were not extended? In other words, what would be the cost of trying to get someone else on board? What would be the delay or some of the ramifications to our business if this were not to be extended? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Second Vice Chair. That's always an excellent question to ask so that we understand what would we face if we were to turn this down or take no action. So, Mr. McLeod, let me begin with you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's a great question because the current contract expires in June of this year. If we did not have that system, we would essentially rely on paper products. The vast majority of, well, actually, I think all of our electronic fares are processed through Mesabi, with the exception of, some of the electronic payments that happen through ticket vending machines, et cetera. But the vast majority of our fares are supported by this system. If we did not have this system, not only would it prevent our current customers from continuing to use EcoPasses, college passes that have already been paid for, but it would also affect customers that have mobile ticketing and have already purchased fares in advance and put it into their wallets to spend at a later time. So it would cause a huge administrative issue, certainly a huge customer service issue. Where we intend to go forward with this is, since we just implemented several changes to the fare system in 2024, simplifying and reducing our fares. Where we would like to go is spend this next intervening 2 years to work on an overall revenue system strategy to be brought to the board that can continue to set us up for success in the future with changing technologies, et cetera, and try to continue to draw a lot of these different technologies into a single system for reporting and analysis purposes. That 2-year period is really intended to provide approximately 6 months to a year to really evaluate that strategy going forward, and also to go out to a procurement process for a competitive procurement process for replacement, not necessarily replacement for Mesabi, but just the process we must go through on a regular basis with current contracts expiring.
If I might, Mr. Chair, thank
I was
you.
going to ask you if you needed anything further, so please proceed.
Thank you. And I guess you answered my question. I was very concerned about what that would do to our customer service. And I think you definitely answered my question, but also the fact that we are going to go out again for competitive procurement for a comprehensive system kind of answered the second part of my question. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And those are 2 points to highlight during this discussion so that we understand the importance of this contract extension. Director Rusha, you are recognized.
Thank you, sir. I also want to thank Mr. McLeod for answering some of the questions that we had previously when this was first presented, and I've had some time to think about it. And I just wanted to note that under legislation passed in the last couple of years, which yours truly also worked on, as well as Director Lewis, we are required as a government entity in Colorado to ensure that all of our digital communications are WCAG compliant. And when I did a little bit of research, I wasn't entirely sure if this vendor, while might meeting some federal standard, would meet this our state standard. And so I just kind of want to flag that, and maybe we could follow up offline. And then I also just had a question. By approving this vote, is there any room for any contract amendments, or what we might also call a change order if we wanted to add any additional functions or benefits, what am I trying to say? To the app. I've used it, I like it. I think there are maybe a few more things that we could do, because as I noted it previously in committee, I want to make it as easy as possible for people to buy a ticket. And I was just wondering, as a matter of how our bylaws and procurement work and the delegation of authority, is there enough room in this authorization for some flexibility, or would it need to come back to this committee? Or do we think that changes enough or minor that it would fall under the delegation of authority and be well below that limit? Thank you.
Thank you, Director. An interesting and perhaps loaded question. The response that I will give you first, and then let Mr. McLeod weigh in on this. In part, understand in terms of further enhancements and improvements, bells and whistles, if you will, to the system overall. That's part of what's going to be under study over the next 2 years as we do this extension and look at doing a new system. So much of that will be addressed there. In terms of amendments to this contract, that would have to go through the ordinary course and is not something that ordinarily we would expect, having let a contract for these services, that we'd want to come back with a series of change orders. That's a slippery slope. But I believe that much of what you ask about is what is in the finance department's plan going forward in the future. Now, Mr. McLeod, I probably misspoken on at least 3 points, so I'll give you a chance to correct me.
Thank you. No, you hit the nail on the head, and essentially any substantial fare changes. I'm not an expert in the civil rights requirements. However, any substantial changes, including changes to our system, require an equity analysis, et cetera. And for things, so I'm trying to remember in the past some of the enhancements we've made, such as adding fare capping to our system. That was a really well-received customer benefit. Those discussions we always bring to the board, because it's really important for us to communicate those items. And I'm not necessarily sure those rise to the level of a contract amendment, but we actually have no plans in place to make any additional significant enhancements. I think there might be some tweaks around the edges that we might want to address, having concluded the fare study and equity analysis and putting things in place. And I think those mainly surround things like reporting and some information that we get to manage the system on the back end. But Mr. Chair, if okay, I'd like to ask Monica Triple-Harnke to give some input on that too.
Thank you, Ms. McLeod. I saw her hand go up and I was about to recognize her next because I figured she had something to add to the conversation. So Ms. Monica Triple-Harnke, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yes, we'll do, the Mesabi system is software as a service. So there is some improvements, like any other software. that, can be used through license, that are, just ongoing that the vendor adds. There's also some, we're gonna look at them with them at existing functionality or modules or options that we could use. And it depends, some of these items are included in the software, and others there would have to be some payments, but generally it is what it is as a software as a service, and we can decide what we want to use, and we'll have to determine what tweaks do we want to make, and what cost would be involved. But yeah, we're not gonna do anything significant under this significant. We are not planning on any large changes to this contract. That would be in, under this contract, that would be in that next phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Ruscia, your hand is still raised, so I take it you have a follow-up to that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. And then this will be my final comment. So I occasionally get feedback from our blind community, that parts of our website are not accessible, and I am able to very quickly reach out to the right person, and we can make those corrections. We again are required to be fully compliant with state law with a policy in place by July 1 of this year, and there are some parts of our board packets that are still not accessible to members of our blind community, and that's something that I think the board office can handle. So that's why I just brought up this. Not being a seeing person, I'm not. It wouldn't be obvious to me if some of our software or parts of our website are not compliant. As a person who's worked on web design, I might be able to catch a few red flags. So with that, I would just ask, has this been tested with, have we received feedback from our blind customers regarding this app? Has this been tested? Is that part of the equity analysis? I just want to make sure that if it turns out there were some bugs that need to be addressed, that we can in fact do that. So but that was the reasoning behind my question, and if we need to follow up offline, I completely understand. But thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me a few more bites at the apple. I promise that was the last one.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that in more ways than one. But I will point out that the question is a legitimate one, just to have a confirmation from staff that there has been compliance checking on the software as a service, the Mesabi contract, to address these issues. And so, Mr. McLeod, I ask you to provide that confirmation, please.
I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, but I would like to ask Monica Triple-Harnke to weigh in on that as well.
And Ms. Triple-Harnke, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we always work with our accessibility manager, ADA manager. However, this has been implemented a while. This is not a new software to us, so I was not part of testing for that particular aspect. I've always been historically involved more in the fare calculations. So I will find out. And certainly, the requirement is always to be compliant with the federal regulations. Now I will have to look into see if anyone has done a gap analysis for the Colorado legislation. So we'll have to get back to you on that one.
Thank you very much. And you just said the 8 magic words that respond to so many things in life, in law, and elsewhere. Let me get back to you on that. So we appreciate that. Before I go to Vice Chair and Director Lewis, thank you for your patience, but I got to go to the committee members first. I see General Counsel's hand is raised, and so I acknowledge General Counsel at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll go back through the emails, but this analysis was done back in April of 2023, and I believe it was provided to the board. I can't put my hands on that actual memo that went out, but we will definitely locate that and get it circulated to you all.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your being on top of that. That's terrific.
You're
Before
welcome.
going to Director, I'm sorry, was there something else?
No, I just said you're welcome, Mr. Chair.
All right. Before going back to, I'm so unused to hearing that, I just went charging ahead. Before going to Director Lewis, Mr. Vice Chair, you are recognized.
I just wanted to ask one quick question. When did we begin our using Masabi as a service with RTD? Was it 2016?
So the question is to Mr. McLeod, do you know when our original relationship with them began and the contract was entered into? That rings a bell in my mind because I remember looking at this contract when I first got on the board. Mr. McLeod, you are on mute, so your sage observations are not being heard by us.
That's probably a good thing because I was going to defer to Monica again for the exact dates. I know we've had them for a while and implemented different things such as mobile ticketing, but I think Monica knows the history pretty well on that. So Monica, if you could help me out with that, that'd be great.
Ms. Tripel-Harnke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so we did mobile ticketing only on this Just Right platform by Masabi, and for a long time. And we started this at the end of 2017 with the first mobile tickets. So I don't remember when the initial contract was signed, but I would assume it was early 2017 probably.
Right.
And then we added the functionality for account-based ticketing. I think that's in the board packet. October 2020 was the board approval for that. That was a very large amendment. And we implemented the first part for retail customers in July 2000, and it was in August, right after we came back from Zero Fare for Better Air. Sorry, but it was basically in the summer of 2022. Right after the Zero Fare for Better Air in that year ended, we started with the new, also called it My Ride Stored Value, and then the past programs, Eco College, Neighborhood Eco. The cards were immediately usable on the new system, but really the transition for our institutional customers to be able to manage all these accounts, the riders, and also the new tokens, the new mobile barcodes, or the brand new MyRide card. That was really something that happened over the second half of last year. So it's been a journey, but it's been a while. But again, mobile ticketing was the longest stretch, and we still have the mobile ticketing. We just I shouldn't say just, but we added the account-based functionalities.
All right, thank you. So it did commence sometime back in 2017 when I recall first hearing about this contract. Vice Chair, did that respond to your question?
Yes, I just want to make one comment. The reason I asked that is because I think both RTD and Masabi won an award because of our collaborative work together. And having a longstanding relationship with this particular vendor has allowed us to let them grow with us as we continue to forge forward with a mobile application service. I think that's really important because they understand how RTD works. To Director Catlin's point, changing this right now would be quite a difficult process and a challenge for everybody. But also they have been and proven to be a leader and a great partner within the transit agency. So when we get there, I will be moving this forward out of committee with my vote if possible. Thanks. That's all I've got.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. I think the bandwagon is getting pretty full right now, so that's good. Director Lewis, thank you for being so patient. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have two quick questions and one comment. I'll start with the comment. Perhaps Doug McLeod, we could talk to our ADA coordinator and possibly have a poll of our ACPD and APAC members to kind of get a sense of how Masabi is working for them. I'm pretty sure we're meeting federal and state standards, but I'm pretty sure Masabi wants to be the best they can. And if there are any hiccups or anything that needs to be improved, I'm pretty sure they would jump on that. So the first two questions I do have, and they're pretty quick. Can we determine what our riders pay and bank fees every time they swipe their card? Is that like a penny, 2 pennies? Can anybody give me an idea?
And Ms. Traple-Harnke, why don't you take a shot at responding to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, they don't, we do. Just like in any, retail transactions, the riders or the customers don't pay, the vendor does.
Okay. The second question, if the bank increases fees during this 2-year period, are we able to negotiate that, or do you have to eat those costs?
Ms. Traple-Harnke, do you have a response to that, or does Ms. McLeod?
I do have a response. Thank you. Well, we basically, okay, so the processing is through Masabi. It's through Masabi's bank. So they pass all the pass everything through us at cost or slightly below cost for the payment processing. We could at that point try to renegotiate with Masabi. Chances are probably not very high, just because we've looked at the fees, because we also use our own merchant bank for other credit card processing, for example, TVMs, and the fees were very comparable. We felt at the time it was okay to process through Masabi, have them have the the PCI compliance issues, or not issues, but be responsible for that. So we would have to see if there's any significant increases, but chances are that our own bank would probably do the same. So, and we could technically switch processing from their bank to ours. That would probably take a while, but that would be an option we could consider at the time if it's a bad deal, basically.
Thank you for those responses. Thank you, Mr. Director.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis. Appreciate that. And Mr. McLeod, you wanted to supplement that.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to add a little bit. Monica hit all the valid points. Director Lewis, I think that's a great suggestion with APAC and doing a poll, and we'll definitely take that away. One thing I was going to mention regarding the fees is the largest portion of the fees are charged by the card issuer, so Visa, MasterCard, etc. And those fees, they're usually a percentage of the transaction. So there's usually a percentage of the transaction, then there's a fixed fee, also a fixed minimum fee. So the combination of those two is applied to each transaction. And the percentage can vary widely. So on a card that may be a cashback card or some kind of reward card that the customer holds, those fees are typically higher because some of that payment reverts to the customer at some point through rewards, etc. So it seems to range from, I would say, approximately 2% to 3.5%, depending on the type of card used, generally speaking. One interesting thing I thought might be a good supplemental discussion is APTA was looking to possibly approach the U.S. Congress to consider what's done in California. So for small transactions, there's a law in California that smaller transactions have a fixed rate. So if you can imagine, if you go to a vending machine and buy a $1 can of soda pop, a 3% fee on that is a lot bigger chunk of money to, in comparison to plus the fixed fee is a lot bigger chunk of money of that purchase than it would be to a large purchase of, something else with a credit card because of that fixed fee. So in California, they have actually mandated that card issuers can only charge a certain amount for these low transaction fee or low value transactions. So APTA was really interested in that and how it might apply towards transit agencies, because the typical individual purchase of a fare is usually only a few dollars. And so it can typically be a pretty good chunk of that money that goes from the transit agency back to the card issuer. So there's been a lot of discussion on that and how it might benefit transit agencies and what can be done about that to try to control that portion of the costs. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for the ability or the chance to add to Monica's comments.
Well, and thank you for supplementing with that information, because it's good to know that the issue is being addressed and that APTA, the American Public Transportation Association, is part of that examination and advocacy, and that we are in touch with that and following that progress. So thank you for that, sir. Are there any other comments, questions relative to the recommended action for the Mesabi contract extension? Hearing none, we'll conclude the discussion, and I'll now call for the vote. And I will ask, before I do that, I need to note Director Bobby Deschel, a member of the committee, has joined us and is present for this discussion. So I just wanted Director Deschel to know that we know he's there, babysitting and all. And I'd like to ask at this point, are there any no votes on this recommended action? Hearing none, the motion as made by Vice Chair Guzman and seconded by Board Second Vice Chair Catlin is approved by 7 aye votes. There are no negative votes and there are no abstentions. And so the motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. We then turn to the portion of our agenda that is called discussion items. There is one discussion item on the agenda for tonight, and it relates to something we talked about in our work plan, and that's budget reporting content enhancements. You will recall, this is what I have sometimes referred to as the Goldilocks issue, that formerly we had budgets that were extremely long, detailed, involved. The board said, hey, can we trim this down? Then it got way trimmed down. So we went from too much to too little, and now we're kind of looking for what's the Goldilocks level that will be just right. So I'm going to again call upon our Chief Financial Officer, Doug McLeod, to present this item on budget reporting content enhancements. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. And yes, that was a great opening. I do have a slide presentation to go through to kind of begin the conversation about some of the proposed enhancements based on the feedback that we've heard from board members and others after having gone through the 2024 budget approval process in October and November of 2023. So I'll go through a timeline as well, but this is intended to begin the discussion, get everybody thinking about what they would like to see so we can get feedback as staff. So when we get to that point in the process where we're actually discussing the budget and the budget numbers, as well as coming with a recommended action, we've met the needs of everybody in terms of providing correct information, understanding that we want to keep that balance too in what we publish for the public consumption, that it's easily understandable, usable, possibly more graphics than spreadsheets and the like. So that would be our intent. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will begin the presentation. And Mr. Chair, can you confirm that you can see this presentation?
Yes, sir, I can. It's not in slide mode. There you go. Now it's in slide mode and I can see it. Thank you, sir.
Great, thank you. So probably 10 or so slides this evening. And what I'd like to cover is just a kind of a level setting on what the current budget process and the current budget reporting is. Secondly, what potential enhancements we're thinking of doing as staff for the committee as well as the public. And then a listing, I'll finish up a listing of next steps and what that would look like for the remainder of this fiscal year. So our current budget process, the purpose really of a budget is to have the governing body approve an appropriation that's recommended by staff to be used over our fiscal year. For RTD, our fiscal year is January to December. within that appropriation process, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, it's very detailed the way we build up our budget. You can imagine there's several departments, and within there's several cost centers, et cetera. So it's a long, very involved process, and we have lots of detail. Part of the reason for that is not just to help manage individual business units, but also to obtain or to have in place budgetary controls. So all of our budgeting and our financial system of record for actuals is done through Oracle. So if you were to look inside Oracle, you'll see a lot of detail in there. And the reasoning for that is to have budgetary controls that only what's appropriated by the board for the specific purposes that they were appropriated may be spent. And that's why we come back to the board occasionally asking for a budget transfer that meets certain criteria or additional appropriations, because we followed the appropriation that was agreed to at the beginning of the year, and any deviations from that meet a certain threshold need to be brought back to the board for a recommended action. So as we develop the budget, there's a lot of cross-departmental coordination that goes on. We're actually enhancing that as part of our Back to Basics strategic initiative, to not wait so long until the end of the year to really get this conversation going. So we've actually already had several departmental budget meetings that will continue. Then we'll have larger quarterly meetings internally to discuss this detail. So there's a lot more of the collaboration under the guise of one RTD. We put together detailed operating as well as capital budgets, and I'll talk a little bit more about the capital budgets and the enhancements we intend to make there. I mentioned cost center level. So cost centers are how we categorize transactions. So myself as the CFO, I have my own cost center, and below me within my department, there's several other cost centers for things like accounts payable, payroll, et cetera. So essentially each one of those cost centers, the way we gather that information, we can run a financial statement for every cost center within the agency, which allows me as a manager as well as the other managers to manage to our budgets. So we do have a lot of detail. We don't publish all of that because it's just too much information. But again, that would be something that we'd be happy to discuss with anybody who would like to see the detail at any point in time. Our capital budgets are prepared by project number within Oracle. If an appropriation is made by the board for a specific capital project, it's assigned a project number. That budget is applied to that project number, and then it's tracked all the way through the life of that project to where we cannot exceed, and that the project expenditures have to meet the intent of that appropriation. Capital projects, we've really worked a lot over the last couple of years aligning with our strategic plan, as well as continuing to work on our transit asset management plan. So we have $9.3 billion in assets. As you can imagine, that's a massive effort in terms of gathering all that information, as well as maintaining it in terms of evaluating the state of good repair of each one of those individual assets. And then what generally you see as board members is budgetary reports at more of a summary level, and that's the Goldilocks scenario that we're trying to get to. We have all this detail that we can certainly provide and discuss with anybody. However, for public consumption as well as valuation, kind of at a high level, it makes a lot more sense to do it at a more summary level. It's just a discussion as to what level that summary is at. Just a few more things about the current budget process. So we often have referred to the midterm financial plan, which was a 6-year forecast beyond the current budget year. That's done for planning purposes, and that usually precedes, well, every year it precedes the development of the budget, because what we want to ensure as an agency is to ensure that whatever we're recommending to the board as a budget appropriation for 1 year, that we're fiscally sustainable for the remaining years, because we tend to have large expenditures in some years for replacing buses, infrastructure, things like that. We need to look out over a longer period to make sure that what we're currently asking for is sustainable. So as part of that, we are changing the terminology from the midterm financial plan that was approved by the board in 2023 to a 5-year financial forecast in 2024 for the period going forward. That will come, I'll talk about the schedule for that later, but that fiscal sustainability outlook is really the basis for which we develop the next year's budget. So it has to be fiscally sustainable. September, October historically has been when we've begun the budget discussions with Finance Planning Committee and as well as the board. And that begins the discussion. Then by state statute, RTD must post for public consumption and comment a draft budget by October 15th of each year. Then in November, we historically have come back to the board and asked or recommended what that budget should be based on additional information, any feedback we've received, et cetera. Then January 1st, the beginning of our fiscal year, that budget would be in effect, assuming that the board has approved and appropriated that budget. And then throughout the year, we constantly monitor all the way down to the, not just the department level, but to the cost center level, how we are performing in regard to operating expenses versus budget, as well as our capital expenditures. And we provide that information within the board briefings. The monthly financial statements and the board briefings are include both an actual expenditure column and a budgetary column to compare to, and then a variance. So you can see at any given month where we stand financially. By the way, I'll be giving a mid-year financial update, I believe in June, potentially May. I think it's June, to this committee to point out some of those financial facts. So just a couple more items. I won't hit on all these. Financial records that we keep are at a very, very detailed level. So every transaction, we can pull transaction information. We actually post that on our website. So you could go look at the accounts payable register within the financial website, financial page of the RTD website, and see every transaction that occurred in every month for the last 3 years. So we keep lots of detailed information and present that in different formats. But one of the intents of this discussion is how best to present that information and make it available, make it visible and transparent, so you don't have to know to go dig through specific reports and know where to find them. So we're working on that through a dashboard process, which I'll mention here in a few minutes too. The current content of the information that we provide is very similar to many other agencies. So it was when we came to the summarized report from that very detailed report, we really did a lot of research in developing the contents of that report, understanding that it's not meeting the needs, but it's really, if you were to go look at Jefferson County, for instance, our budget report is very similar to theirs. So the main contents of that budget report currently is a board report with the resolutions and presentation materials that we bring to the board, both in the discussion as well as the recommended action. We also include a proposed budget report. That budget report includes a letter from the general manager, as well as narratives, comparative cash flows, and some supporting information kind of at that summary level. So the user can really understand from a high level perspective, where does RTD's money get spent and what are we asking for to be spent in the future? We also provide supporting schedules, and I'll refer to these later. This is where we'll want to do some enhancements potentially. These supporting schedules are schedule A, B, and C. So when we present the draft budget in October for public consumption, when we come back with a recommended budget, we show in schedule A what changed between the draft budget and the current budget as part of that discussion. Schedule B is new capital expenditure requests. So any new items not previously appropriated by the board, we would come to the board with this request to appropriate funding for those new capital assets. And then the big one is the capital carry forward from prior fiscal years. So many of these projects, capital projects, are either long-term construction projects or they have a long lead time. For every purchase that RTD makes, we need to have the funding up front appropriated and identified. It's got to be appropriated by the board. By state statute, it has to be identified prior to entering a contract. So when I talk about budgetary controls, when we load the budget that's approved by the board into Oracle, it's already loaded in there, but we actually have to make it active once it's approved. Those budgetary controls prevent anybody from spending any more money that's actually there. So when a purchase requisition for a new procurement is initiated, that budgetary funding has to be available in that in Oracle for that particular line item, or it will not be processed. So before our contracts and procurement department can even go out and solicit a bid for work, the funding has to be appropriated and in place within the system before that purchase requisition goes through the system, creates a purchase order, and then a contracting procurement activity happens. So the capital carry forward is really just projects that haven't been finished, and we asked the board, there's this remaining funding on each of these projects. We'd like you to appropriate it and carry it into next year so we can continue and finish each one of these items. So now I'll move into some of the enhancements that staff would like to do based on the feedback that we've gotten from committee and board members as well as others. Some of those enhancements really revolve around making sure that they're in alignment when we develop the budget with our strategic priorities and initiatives, and describing how those are related within the budget documents. We also want to provide more information with the transit asset management plan. So when we talk about the TAM plan, that's essentially the Schedule B and C, which is new capital and capital carry forward, which describes the assets and the projects that those assets roll up into, of which we're trying to accomplish and which we'd like an appropriation for. We've also looked at Government Finance Officers Association, the GFOA best practices. We've been working with Reuben Brown, our internal auditors, having them take a second look at some of those best practices and work with staff to include some of those best practices in the report that you and the public will see. And of course, public input and research on other governmental entity reporting too would help guide the enhancements that we intend to put in place for this upcoming budget process. But what do we intend to accomplish with some of these enhancements? Certainly increase transparency. So our general manager is often referred to that we're data rich and information poor. So when I mentioned our website, we have a lot of information out there, but a lot of it's buried in reports and not necessarily easily accessible from a knowing where to go standpoint or a digestible type of format. So we're doing a lot of things internally to try to enhance the ability to understand and find information. And I'll talk a little bit about our dashboard initiatives. One of the other things we'd like to do in the budget report is also expand the departmental and strategic plan alignment narratives. So if you were to go back to the last budget report, we do have narratives in there. We talk generally about some of the major categories, salaries, benefits, and talk about those in that respect. We intend to expand that and talk about it more on a departmental basis, how that aligns with our strategic plan and what the outlook is for each of those items. We provide a departmental pie chart currently that shows departmental expenditures by department. We will expand that to include a full cash flow. So if you want to go see what bus operations expends for salaries, wages, benefits, outside services, we'll have that information in there. So it's just an enhancement to the information being provided. We also want to expand people power is one of our 3 strategic initiatives that we're really focused on, and the board has been very involved in some of those discussions. So we'll expand that discussion in the budget document too, talking about where we have vacancies by area, what we intend to hire, et cetera. Just a lot more information about our people power will be included in the budget documents. And then one area that we've been working towards as an agency is really trying to enhance our transit asset management information. We still have ways to go because of the size of this effort, but that should guide our future planning in terms of repairs and replacements. So there's still some work to be done on that, but as part of that budgetary discussion, we'll enhance a lot of the descriptions of what we're asking for money for, and also provide information of here's the universe of assets that we know need to be replaced, what condition they're in, just to be able to provide that on an ongoing basis, both through the dashboard and the budget reporting process. And also discuss if we run into backlogs of actually being able to repair and replace things on time. And then finally, additional graphics with trend data. I think that's much more informative than just providing a table of numbers to communicate where we've been, where we're going, and why. So just a little more detail. The supporting schedules, we'd still like to continue to provide those. I think those are important to have a tracking mechanism for any changes in the different versions of the draft budgets before we come with a final recommended action for a budget approval. So we'll expand some of the definitions and descriptions and a justification for each one of those changes that were made from draft to draft. New capital requests, definitely understand that there's room for improvement on the list of capital items in those schedules. There's a lot more information we could provide that I think would be super helpful in terms of expanding the project description for each line item, saying what it is, where it is, as well as anticipated start and completion dates, the funding source description, and then justification for why are we asking for this particular item to be funded. The same thing for the capital carry forward schedule, same types of expanded information I think would be much more informative for the board to consider each one of these items and their appropriation. So wrapping up this presentation, the next steps, you can see here broken down by month, what that might look like. So tonight is April 16th. So any feedback you want to provide now is great. We'll also be coming back in May and June to discuss this further. If you want to take some time to really consider and make some pointed recommendations that we can take into account. At the May meeting, we will be discussing TABOR and fiscal policy because both of those items dovetail into how we'll be developing the budget for 2025 as well as the 5-year financial forecast. June would be where we'd ask for additional feedback, probably give some examples of like the capital carry forward schedule, what we're thinking that might look like with the description and start and end dates, those types of things to gather additional input. And then we're also going to discuss the financial dashboard that's being developed. It's not just financial dashboard, it's an overall dashboard on the website that Stuart Summers is helping us develop. It includes information from throughout the agency and really more encapsulated and summarized formats where you can go click on the financial portion of the dashboard and go see a graph of here's where RTD's money is spent. Here's where the asset management plan status currently lies. So that's the type of information that we're really thinking would be very transparent, easy to access, and complement what we're bringing to the board in terms of content for the budget reports. Then July would be when we first start discussing the 5-year financial plan with the Finance Planning Committee, come back in September with a recommended action for that 5-year forecast. And then again, we stay on the same schedule in terms of we don't want to come too early with a budget for the next fiscal year because there's a lot of things that can change if you do it too early. We want to get the most current information and assumptions in place. So we'll have these discussions throughout the year leading up to the main draft budget, which will be presented in October. Then we would come back in November and ask for as a recommended action for the committee and the board to approve the appropriation for 2025. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or receive any feedback at this point.
Thank you very much. That's most helpful. And I will open up for a full discussion by the committee regarding their feedback on this. A couple of observations. Note that in the presentation of the budget in October to this committee and the board, we will have the advantage then of the September CU Lead School of Business report relative to revenues. And so as Mr. McLeod mentioned, things can change. You don't want to prepare the budget too soon because that report may give us a different picture of what things are going on. Also, what is important to emphasize here, much of the information that you may have asked about in the past or that you're interested in is actually available to the public on the website. I know there are people, and I know that our board chair Davidson will be talking about this tomorrow when addressing the bill currently before the legislature. One of the sections of that bill provides for enhanced financial reporting. I submit that all that enhanced financial reporting is essentially all being done currently. Okay, with that, let me open the floor to any, first of all, committee members who have comments, questions, reactions, feedback to Mr. McLeod's presentation. All right, let me open to the full Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Vice Chair, you are recognized, sir.
Sorry, my mouse wasn't working. Mr. McLeod, just a bit of feedback for you as requested. All of this looks really good. Thank you for the hard work. I think that one of the conversations we had last year around budget time was definitely, a lack of understanding of one sheet page and needing to go through it in more detail. So thank you for that. What I don't see still is what's left over. Maybe it's compacted into the TAMP plan, I'm not sure. But what projects are being delayed, and why aren't they moving forward? Or how are we prioritizing? And if that's part of TAM, great, then it's there. I just didn't see it, or I didn't understand that part. But what we're working on also needs to be considered, and what's being left off of being focused on immediately, so that we can work on other priorities, just so that we have an understanding if we're leaving some particular part behind in the budgeting process for allocations that need to be set ahead of time, why we're prioritizing one thing over the other. And the justification piece, obviously that would go with that. And so just making sure that that is part of that conversation, so that for transparency purposes, when we have folks ask about why we're doing A instead of B, that we are able to communicate that back to community in an effective manner. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Ms. McLeod, your response to that, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, really appreciate that feedback, Director Guzman, and absolutely, I think that's a critical component to have a full understanding of the universe of items that need to be repaired and replaced, and if we're having any delays for whatever reason and why that reason is, if it's a staffing issue, if it's a supply chain issue, those kinds of things. Certainly it'd be very good information to provide to this body. And I think, once that information, our TAM plan becomes more complete and we get a lot more information in terms of condition assessments, et cetera, which are ongoing, it'll really help the agency and the governing body too, to make some of those determinations and prioritizations as to not only what needs to be done, but why, and why we're doing it when we are. So understood. Great suggestion. Appreciate that.
Great, thank you. Director Ruscia, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to note that I think it was last month or the prior month where I had requested if we could get the most updated policy or definitions of our funds, because a fund indicates that there are specific rules and guidelines around it, and I did notice even in our last budget session, sometimes we use synonyms that aren't always synonyms, and it was never clearly explained to me when I came on board last year what our specific fund rules were. And so when we think about where's this coming from in our budget, that I think would be critical. Now, I also understand that we might update the fiscal policy and some of that might change. And so I would just again ask if we could get something from staff, that clearly explains our funds and the policies around them, including the FISA, including unrestricted. That would be very beneficial before we, I presume in the future, vote on any changes. One obvious one, I think, is the unrestricted fund. And I won't go into the history of that, but that's just, one thing that had concerned me last year. I also just want to make a couple of comments. I really appreciate capital budgets prepared by project number. And I think one thing that we were missing, or someone like me was missing in the budget presentation for the board, is I think the function and subfunction. And sometimes we say capital project, and when really it might be a capital expenditure for a specific department. And so I just wanted to flag that, and I hope that's something that staff is continuing to work on. As far as the public facing dashboard, I think this is really excellent for individuals who are going to vote on a potentially $1.3 billion budget. There might be some things that we still need to make sure we have access to information to. And as I have pointed out in previous committees, and I think at our retreat, other peer agencies that we compare ourselves to do have comprehensive budget books. And it doesn't mean you have to read every page, but it does mean that if you need something, the citation and the reference is there. And I think that is, given the size of our agency and all of the assets that we have to manage, I think that's an appropriate goal to strive toward. So even if we, aren't going to get there fully this year, I would hope that this body and the board can work with staff to set goals. Just recognizing, again, we are responsible for an extraordinary amount of money, and we do have a debt service consideration. And I think that would go very far, both in these budget discussions, excuse me, and I think what is expected by us as stated by members of the public and the legislature. So I really want to thank staff for this, and if it were possible, Mr. McLeod, if you would be willing to take a meeting with any members who are interested in this process, maybe we could just kind of sit down and you have more granular discussions of what that looks like for feedback, so we don't take up too much of committee time, just like you were generous enough to offer your time last year when we had questions about the budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to speak, and also Mr. McLeod and staff for all your work on this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Director Ruscia. Some good comments there. I was wondering if, Mr. McLeod, you might, there were a number of things, and I know you were taking notes, but as to the first item concerning fund balances and rules regarding expenditures from dedicated fund balances, if you might just take a moment to expand upon that a little bit, because I would like the committee to have the benefit of your take on that at this point, and then we know that the other items will also require further response at some later time. But if you could take a moment to address that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's a very important point, and I will be sure, certainly when we have the financial review, mid-year financial review, and further discussions, to make sure I speak more to the fund balances. But essentially, if I had to summarize, RTD is a single fund. So if you look at any government agency, say take the city and county of Denver, if you look at their financial statements, they have several funds. Some are proprietary funds where there's a fee charged, and so they have books for that particular fund. Other governmental funds that don't have fees are supported by taxes. So if you look at their financials, they have all these funds going across that consolidate into a single entity for their full report. RTD is not like that. We're a single proprietary fund. So we are just one fund for all intents and purposes in terms of bookkeeping. When you talk about our fund balances, so fund balances are everything that's left over after you subtract liabilities from assets. So it's on your balance sheet. It's kind of like your savings account. Within that fund balance, a certain portion of that is liquid available assets, and the rest is all tied up in fixed assets. For instance, we can't just, if we needed money, we can't go out and sell a train car and generate cash to go use for something else. So we separate out our net investment and capital assets from the remaining fund balances. So what's left over is we have four main categories. One is the Fast Track's internal savings account. One is the capital replacement fund. Fast Track, the FISA is used, was established through board direction in 2013 to start accumulating any excess funds which were prescribed or specific items that would go into that fund, the FISA fund, and build that up with the specific explicit intent to use that funding to complete unfinished Fast Track's elements. So the board can at any time set up a fund or segregate certain funding for specific purposes, and that's how that one was developed. Second one is capital replacement fund. As part of the fiscal policy, we've agreed that we're going to try to cash fund instead of borrow money when we make large capital purchases. So we've built that fund up, and that continues to be used for our asset management, repair, and replace activities. The third one, and very important one that's been established for many years, and it's based on a GFOA best practice. The GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, recommends that governments keep 2 months of operating expenses in reserves to deal with any economic shocks, any other unexpected items. RTD is elected through the board process to actually do it at 3 months to be conservative because we're so dependent on sales and use tax. So that fund is kept separate with enough funding to provide expenses for 3 months of operating costs. And then finally, everything else that's left over goes into the unrestricted fund. So I can talk about this in more detail in the future, but that's kind of in a nutshell how our fund structure is broken down. And we can certainly adjust that. And I'd like to discuss that as part of the fiscal policy discussion too, because we've come up with some ideas in the revenue diversification working group that may be something the board might want to consider in light of the Tabor impacts that may help with our fiscal sustainability. So hopefully that kind of answers that item, Mr. Chair, but I'd be happy to answer anything else.
No, I appreciate that very much because that was a very, very cogent explanation of that first element that Director Ruscha raised that I wanted to make sure we got on the record tonight so that the committee members would have an opportunity to consider that. And of course, as to all of these things, this is not the end of the discussion. This is the beginning of a discussion that will continue to carry on with much more to follow. Director Ruscha, we'll go to you for your final comment of the evening.
I don't know if that was a polite request or a comment. But yes, final comment of the evening. I think I just also wanted to provide some clarification if needed. So when so I understand the FISA is essentially an earmark. But what I'd asked for previously is, could we have, all of the board approved policies related to the FISA, like, so we had something of a library. And I think that's very important, particularly considering some of what I think people's misunderstandings are of the FISA and what it can and cannot do or what it's for. And then when I referenced, I think I said the unrestricted fund, my understanding is several years ago, it was either, I don't know if it was an initiative or official board policy that we expected that, to be spent down or be a much lower number at what it is now. And that's changed. Sometimes we say capital reserves and sometimes we say a replacement fund, and reserves can be more than one thing if there isn't a definition. And so that's where I was suggesting that both in our next budget book, but prior to fiscal policy change conversations, in fact, as soon as practicable, if we could get just some of this on paper. And again, if you would be willing to meet with me, I would love to just come in, or perhaps even we could do, time permitting when you're available, just another budget training on some of these more granular issues. I think that would help make the budget, well, for the board, it might be a budget season. For you, it's all year long. Just run a little bit smoother. So I just want to provide some clarification, but thank you so much for that. And I will yield for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it was not intended to be a shutdown, Director, I assure you. But no, I do appreciate that. Mr. McLeod, any closing thoughts on that based upon Director Ruscha's comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one thing I would add too. So the reason I was able to kind of rattle off the contents of the fund balance so easily this evening is because I've been having ongoing discussions with the Office of the State Auditor In fact, we spoke earlier today about the fund balances because they're taking a close look at that too, and how we include those and describe those in our fiscal policy. So yes, that will be something that we will enhance too in terms of the descriptions and what the purpose of those funds are within our fiscal policy, or however they're going to actually have some findings and some recommendations from this financial performance audit from the OSA that will result at the end of, they're supposed to finalize their report by the end of July. So this is all kind of great timing in terms of having all this input from internal auditors, state auditors, and the like. So yes, we intend to have a great product, and I'd be happy to meet with you at any time that's convenient. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That's not surprising. We knew that the OSA, the Office of State Auditor, was doing some of this work with you, and it is nicely timed in terms of working with us to provide this committee and ultimately the full board with that information. Further comments, questions from any committee member or from any director in this meeting? All right, well, I would say we had a very, very productive discussion relative to some of the budget. Director Broom, I see your hand is now raised.
Thank you, Chair. I have one question. Typically, when a district takes over another district, and this goes back to what's, we've been discussing this evening, you have to set aside funds to pay off all the outstanding debt. So my question is, does that also apply if the state of Colorado, which apparently is trying to take over RTD, would they have to issue bonds in order to escrow the funds to pay off all of the obligations of RTD?
Well, who knew we would get a fascinating legal question at the end of the evening here from Director Broom? And I know we have no right to call upon General Counsel Snyder to issue a curbstone opinion relative to that particular issue, but to the extent that you can address the concern raised, which is perhaps more than just rhetorical. General Counsel, do you have any thoughts to share with us?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't at this time. I do think that given the conversation tonight and what we anticipate for tomorrow with potential amendments that may be happening, it's certainly something we can revisit.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Once again, we're back to those 8 magic words. Let me get back to you on that. All right. So, Director Broom, does that satisfy your curiosity at this point?
It does. It's just I don't recall us discussing it up to this point in time.
Correct. I think that is absolutely correct, because we haven't faced these circumstances up until this point in time. All right. That concludes our discussion then on the one discussion item we had on the agenda this evening. Are there any other matters that any committee member wishes to bring forward at this time to the Finance and Planning Committee? Vice Chair Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
I got a quick one. It's good news. Since us unprofessional board members, as we've been accused of being, don't work with our local, state, and federal government, I received a very cool message from Senator Hickenlooper's office that we were awarded a $2 million funding for the South Federal Transit-Oriented Development study to be done in the south end of my district and through the central part of Director Deschelle's district. And I wanted to share that with you after confirmation from his office that it certainly has been awarded. And just end on a high note that we're actually doing director work, and it feels so nice to be back here doing this instead of running around all over the place trying to figure out who's writing what and saying what. So thank you for that.
That is great, good news to share, and thank you for being the messenger on that one. Much appreciated. Other matters from any committee member or from any other director on the board that pertain to the Finance and Planning Committee? Seeing none, we'll close out the discussion of other matters. And I will advise you that the next Finance and Planning Committee meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, May the 14th at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, once again to be conducted on Zoom. At that meeting, pursuant to our work plan, I can advise you that the committee is likely to hold discussions on the following items. First, Zero Fare for Youth Title VI Equity Analysis. You will recall that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires equity analysis for fare changes. That is something that the Zero Fare for Youth obviously effectuates, and therefore we'll have a discussion concerning that equity analysis at that time. The second thing that we anticipate presenting will be a discussion on the Central Park Station transit-oriented development, the Central Park TOD. And then thirdly, as has been mentioned here several times, we'll be discussing the 2025 fiscal policy. That tells you what we're planning for May 14th. But in the meanwhile, I can tell you that we have accomplished what we planned for April 16th. And seeing no other discussion, I'm pleased to advise you that this meeting is adjourned as of 7:44 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you all very much.